Hello everyone and welcome to Tariq and welcome to Tariq classes for class 12th history. Today we'll be starting with the second book which covers the medieval part of the subcontinent starting from the coming of the Turks. Then you have travelers who are coming, then you have Sufism that is coming in the subcontinent and intermingling with the culture that already existed. Then you have Mughals and Vijayanagar Empire, and this is what this book covers. And the chapter for today is Through the Eyes of Travelers Perceptions of Society, circa 10th to 17th century. In the medieval times, people, men, women, they traveled to various places, cities, countries, different empires in search of jobs, in search of to know about that particular place. Sometimes they went to a different place because there was a natural disaster where they were already staying, or there was earthquake, there were floods, and some wanted better job opportunities or military expedition. So people traveled, women also traveled, some of them they wrote accounts of when they traveled. They wrote about the place they went to. They wrote accounts what they saw, something new that they saw, something that kind of matched to their culture, to their place. They wrote about these things. Women also traveled, but we don't know much about their experiences. But there were people who were writing down journals and they were writing down their own accounts. In this book, the focus is on three major travelers. The first is Al-Biruni, who came from Uzbekistan. Then we have Ibn Battuta, who came from Morocco, and then we have Francois Bernier, who came from France. All three travelers came from different social backgrounds. They came from different political, cultural backgrounds. And what was their perception when they saw the subcontinent, when they visited the subcontinent? That is what we are going to understand in this chapter.
The first topic is Al-Biruni and the Kitab-ul-Hind. Al-Biruni was born in 973 in Khwarizm, which is in Uzbekistan. Khwarizm at that point in time was a very important center of learning, and Al-Biruni himself received a lot of education. He was well versed in several languages, of which Syriac, Hebrew, Arabic, Persian and Sanskrit were a few. He did not know Greek per se, but he was aware of Greek philosophers and their works, having read those works that were translated to Arabic. In 1017, Khwarizm was invaded by Sultan Mahmud, and Al-Biruni, along with several other philosophers and people, were taken as prisoners of war back to Ghazni. Now, although he came to Ghazni as a prisoner, eventually he grew to love the cosmopolitan nature of the city and fell in love with the city, and that is where he stayed till he died at the age of 70. जब Al-Biruni गजनी पहुंचे, वहाँ पे उनका इंटरेस्ट संस्कृत की तरफ बढ़ा. It wasn't uncommon for people to be aware of Sanskrit literature, क्योंकि 8th century onwards से ही Sanskrit works on medicine, astrology, mathematics had begun to be translated into Arabic. And जब पंजाब गज़नाविड एम्पायर का पार्ट बना, तो it was even more easy for Al-Biruni to get in touch with the people of the subcontinent, and he would spend a lot of time with the Brahmins, learning about the local customs, and he was very interested in what was happening. And we don't exactly know where all he travelled. उसका record हमारे पास नहीं है, but it is safe to say that he travelled extensively, at least in the Punjab area and the northern part of the Indian subcontinent. ट्रैवल लिटरेचर का जो जॉनर है वो इंडियन सबकॉन्टिनेंट में इतना फेमस नहीं था. The Indian people were not very fond of learning, I think, about other lands, or at least the knowledge in the form of manuscripts was not readily acceptable or available in the Indian subcontinent. But outside of it, people were very fond of learning about new places, कहाँ पे क्या हो रहा है, कैसे हो रहा है. And you would find descriptions of lands as far apart as the Sahara Desert in the west to the river Volga in the north. And while it is likely that Indian subcontinent may people would not have read travel works or even works of Al-Biruni outside India, a lot of people were very well versed in this genre and with Al-Biruni.
Like how now people, when they travel different places, people like write blogs
Yeah,
about different places,
yeah.
about different countries that they have visited. People now have started making vlogs also.
Yeah.
But it's somewhat the
Somewhat similar.
concept.
It's put to text, and now we have, of course, images and short videos to accompany them. But those days, it was just the author's imagination and how he could portray a new world to his audience back at home. Kitab al-Hind की अगर हम बात करें तो it is a very voluminous text and it is written in Arabic. Now Arabic as a language is known to be difficult, but the language that is used in the text is very simple. So that shows that it was not just meant for educated and academic circles or aristocratic circles, but it was also meant for the public to read. It's quite a thick book. It has nearly 80 chapters to it, and they cover a vast variety of topics ranging from astrology to meteorology to laws and customs and iconography and medicine and so on and so forth. When we talk about the structure of the text, although it's not something that is followed uniformly throughout the work, but generally speaking, what Al-Biruni does in Kitab al-Hind is that he poses a question, then he tries to answer the question based on Sanskritic practices and traditions and local, basically when we say local, the traditions local to the Indian subcontinent. He tries to answer it based on what is happening locally, and then as a conclusion he compares it to other cultures and tries to find uniformity or to make sense of something new that he has found based on his past experiences. Scholars have suggested that the structure used in Kitab al-Hind by Al-Biruni is very geometric in nature and it's very methodical, and it somehow ties to his background in mathematics, and because he has that background, so he uses that rationale into solving the problems that he faces in the subcontinent. Now, although primarily Al-Biruni writes in Arabic, his work was intended for people who lived along the frontier to give them an idea of what lies beyond. And he was already aware, like we said, of Sanskrit texts, not just based on medicine, philosophy, astronomy, but also everyday fables, and he had an idea on how to improve on it. So he was aware of the Sanskrit texts and he knew how they were structured, and he had notes on how to make it more maybe enjoyable. He was very critical about the ways in which these texts were written, and he had a few ideas on how to improve on them. Now, in all the talk about frontiers and the people that inhabited them, it is very important to also acknowledge a word which is widely used today, and that term is Hindu. Now, the earliest usage of the word dates back to the 5th-6th centuries BCE, when the Persians used this word to describe the people on the east side of the river Sindhu, which is Indus. The Arabs inherited this term and they called the land on the other side of the river Indus as Al-Hind, and the people that inhabited the land as Hindi. The Turks continued this usage, but they called the people across the river Indus as Hindu, their land as Hindustan, and their language as Hindavi. Now, when you look at this, it is very evident that the term, although in today's day it has religious undertones to it, at its origin and to the usage as far as the 18th century, we would argue, it did not depict a religious undertone. It was about the people that lived on the other side of the river Indus, and it was a purely geographical term.
Ibn Battuta's Rihla. Ibn Battuta, he was born in Tangier, and which is in Morocco, and he had written a book called Rihla, which talks about the cultural, social life and political life of the subcontinent, especially in the 14th century. He belonged to a very well-educated scholastic family who were well versed in the Islamic law, which is known as Shara, and he himself also received scholastic education, and he was a very learned man. He believed that the knowledge that you gain when you travel a place is much more important than the bookish knowledge. So for this reason he loved traveling, and he went to far off places to understand how the society there, or what was the culture in those areas, to understand what made them different from his side of the culture or his side of the country. Before he set off for India in 1332-33, he had already traveled to various places. He had already did a pilgrimage to Mecca. He went to Iraq, Iran, Yemen, Oman, Syria, and also the eastern coast of the African continent. So he had traveled in these areas, and then he planned a trip to the Indian subcontinent. Traveling overland through Central Asia, he reached Sindh in 1333, and he got to know about Delhi Sultan Muhammad bin Tughlaq, and his reputation was really good, and he wanted to meet Muhammad bin Tughlaq. And because he was also, the ruler was also a patron of art and literature. So he set off to Delhi, passing through Multan and Uch, and Muhammad bin Tughlaq was also impressed by Ibn Battuta, and he appointed him as the Qazi of Delhi. He enjoyed the services for a long period of time as being the Qazi, but due to some misunderstanding between him and the Sultan, he fell out of favor and he was thrown into the prison. But soon the misunderstanding was kind of settled, and he was again appointed, he was given that imperial position again, and somewhere in 1342 he was sent as a diplomat to China. In 1342 the Sultan asked him to go as a diplomat to China, to the court of the Mongol ruler. With a new assignment, Ibn Battuta, he travelled to the Malabar coast via central India. From Malabar coast, he went to Maldives, and he stayed there as a Qazi for 18 months. Then he went to Sri Lanka. Then again he went back to Malabar coast. Then again he went to Maldives, and after that he proceeded to China. But before proceeding to China, he went to Bengal, then Assam, then he went to Sumatra, took a ship to Sumatra. From Sumatra, then he went to China, and he got down at the Chinese port called Zaitun. He travelled extensively in China as well, but soon he went back from China somewhere in 1347. His accounts are often compared to Marco Polo's account, who also travelled China from his hometown Venice, and he also travelled to India. But he's always, kind of said that he is the Marco Polo the second or something like that. His accounts have always been compared to the Marco the great globetrotter. Wanderlust, I tell you.
Also, I think Marco Polo is famous because he came from Europe, as opposed to Ibn Battuta, who came from Africa.
Yeah.
So there is a white bias that sort of seeps in when you look at histories relating to Asia and Africa.
Ibn Battuta meticulously he recorded his accounts whenever he travelled, their cultures, their traditions, their political life, their social life. But we need to keep this in mind that it was in this is the 14th century that we're talking about. At that point of time, it was very difficult to travel. It was not very easy to travel. It was pretty dangerous and hazardous, because anything could happen on the way. You could be attacked by the bandits, or it could be a natural calamity, or anything could have happened even when you're crossing empires, invasions, and it was a very difficult thing to do at that point of time. According to him, it took 40 days to travel from Multan to Delhi. It took 50 days to travel from Sindh to Delhi. From Daulatabad to Delhi, it was again, I think, 40 days, and then from Gwalior to Delhi, it took 10 days. So imagine the time phrase, कितना वक्त लगता था एक जगह से दूसरी जगह जाने में. As we've already told you, traveling in the 14th century was people were very insecure at in that period. Ibn Battuta कहते हैं कि अकेले travel करना वो कभी नहीं करते थे, because he always preferred traveling in caravans along with many other companions, because once he was traveling from Multan to Delhi, and his caravan was attacked by robbers. Many of his companions died, and only few of them survived, including Ibn Battuta. But they were severely injured. So it was it was a task. It was not something very easy like how it is nowadays. So they all had to plan it out, how to travel from one place to another. Whether there are sarais on the way,
Yeah.
the sarais were like inns, like you have hotels nowadays. It used to be like that. So if they have good decent sarais on the way, so they would plan it out. As we know that Ibn Battuta traveled extensively, and he traveled for years. So he traveled West Asia, East Africa, he traveled to Russia, he traveled to China, he traveled to the Indian subcontinent, and then after he had traveled to China, somewhere in 1347 he returned back to his home country, Morocco. There the ruler had ordered to write down his accounts in a proper text so that people could read it. It should be recorded properly.
The next topic is Francois Bernier, a doctor with a difference. Now, after the 1500s, when the Portuguese made their way to the subcontinent, the people wrote a lot of accounts about the Indian people, the customs, the differences, and some people like the Jesuit Roberto Nobili even translated Indian works into European languages. Among the best known Portuguese writers is Duarte Barbosa, who wrote a very detailed account of trade practices and society in South India. Now, post the 1600s, a lot of different Europeans made their way to India and wrote about India, and these included the English and the French and the Dutch. Among the French that travelled to India, Jean-Baptiste Tavernier, who was a jeweler by profession, travelled to India at least 6 times. He was particularly fascinated by the trading practices in India and compared India to Iran and the Ottoman Empire. Some travellers like the Italian Menucci travelled to India and settled down here, never to return to their parent country. Francois Bernier की अगर हम बात करें तो he was a French doctor, political philosopher and historian. He too came to the Mughal court in search of new opportunities. He stayed here for 12 years, from 1656 to 1668, and in that time he served as the personal physician to Dara Shikoh, who was the son of Shah Jahan, and later on he extended his services to an Armenian noble in the Mughal court by the name of Danishmand Khan. In his time in India, Bernier travelled extensively throughout the subcontinent, and the work that he created, he dedicated it to Louis XIV, who was a French king. Some other work is also available in the form of letters that he wrote to important ministers in the French court, and in every situation he has described India as a bleak situation when you compare them to the French. So when he is writing about India, he is writing in a very degrading tone. And as we learn later, and as we also see, that is not the real picture that was presented by Bernier, because the situation was completely different. Despite the glaring inaccuracies in Bernier's work, when it was published, it proved to be a massive hit. It was published in French in 1670 to 71, between those years, and then it was translated to English, Dutch, German and Italian in the next 5 years. By 1684, his work was reprinted in English 3 times, and by 1725, it was reprinted in French at least 8 times. Now, there is a marked difference when you compare the works of Asian travelers, especially works that were written in Arabic and Persian, when you compare them to works that were written in European languages. And this was because the European works were mass published and they could be reprinted at a quicker pace, whereas the works that were written in Arabic and Persian were preserved in the form of manuscripts, and so they were not as quick in republishing those works till the time they were actually properly published in the 1800s, by which time the work of the European travelers had already done its damage, so to say.
Making sense of an alien world, Al-Biruni and the Sanskritic tradition. So, according to Al-Biruni and other travelers, whenever they travel to a particular region, a particular place, they try to see a particular custom or tradition and compare it with what they know, कि जैसे कुछ इनको फेमिलियर लगता है, कोई चीज़ कस्टम इनको फेमिलियर लगती है, तो वो उससे कंपेयर करेंगे जिससे वो फेमिलियर होते हैं। बट अल-बरूनी कहते हैं कि व्हेन ही ट्रैवल टू द सब कॉन्टिनेंट ही फेस्ड मैनी इश्यूज एंड प्रॉब्लम्स। The first barrier that he had faced was the barrier of language. संस्कृत को अरबिक और पर्शियन में ट्रांसलेट करना बहुत डिफ़िकल्ट हो गया था। Then the second barrier was the religion. And third barrier was the self-absorption and the ignorance of the people of the subcontinent. Al-Biruni mostly depended on the Brahmanical texts and books, जैसे आपके Vedas हैं, then you have Purans, then you have Bhagavad Gita, Manusmriti, you have Patanjali. So then generally his works depended on these texts. Al-Biruni also talks about the caste system in the Indian subcontinent and tried to understand it by making it compared to, not compare, but looking for a parallel world outside the subcontinent and to see whether it existed in the other place or not. For example, like we have the Varna system here, where Brahmins, Kshatriyas, Vaishyas and Shudras. Similarly, even in Persia, the society was divided into 4 sectors. You have the kings and princes in the first one, knights in the first one, then you have your monks and lawyers and fire priests in the second one. Third में आपके scientists, physicians हैं, astronomers हैं, and in the fourth you have the peasants and the artisans. Al-Biruni कहते हैं कि dividing the population into sections on the basis of caste or on the basis of occupation was only in India. Even other parts of the culture or country, we could see that similarity. But still, in Islamic world, everybody was equal in the for the Almighty. Only difference was the observance and piety. Though he accepted the Brahmanical ideology of the caste system, but he was against the concept of polluting. He was against the concept of social pollution and social polluting that was that existed in the subcontinent, where some people were considered to be polluting and to be not accepted in the social strata of the society, because that went against the law of nature. If something is polluting, then that thing should not have been existing only. Nothing can exist without the other thing and the other substance or the other person. So everything is intertwined, and that is what the law of nature is. But as we know that he came from a different culture, different society. One thing he could not understand was things were not as rigid as it seemed. Though there was social, society-wise, there was stratification on the basis of caste, but sometimes these people who were ousted from the caste system, they were brought in the economic structure. They were included in the economic structure. For example, there were people known as Antyaja who were born outside the caste category, the whole social strata, but they were asked for their services, to render their services by the peasants and the zamindars when it comes to tilling their land or agricultural practices. So that is, you're including them in the economic stratification, in the economic circle. So things were rigid. Yes, there was caste system which was if you see is not acceptable in the today's time, but there were also instances where there was a bit of fluidity also. It wasn't as rigid as it seemed.
So basically, while you did not accept them in your society, you would accept their services to drive your economy.
Yeah.
Which is not any better, but those were the times. The next topic is Ibn Battuta and the excitement of the unfamiliar. Now in the 14th century, by the time Ibn Battuta made his way to Delhi, the subcontinent was already a part of a larger network of communication that stretched from China in the east to Africa and Europe in the west. Now Ibn Battuta was very fond of living in cities, especially cities that had a cosmopolitan nature, because he enjoyed conversing with people in different languages, be it Turkish or Arabic or Persian, even Sanskrit. And he, as we know, traveled extensively, and he even acted as a qazi wherever the situation permitted him. In exchanging stories and ideas with other learned men in these cosmopolitan cities, he exchanged stories about generous kings or kings who were not too cruel, of everyday lives, of fables, of stories, of sometimes of a philosophical nature, sometimes of an unnatural nature, and it was he was just very attracted to anything that was new. Now, the primary motive of his work was to introduce this new unfamiliar land to his readers back at home, and you can see how he approaches the everyday extraordinary things that he finds in these new places. When you see his work, the book describes the descriptions of two such things. One is the coconut, which the tree is very similar to the date palm which you would find in his hometown, but it is also very different. Where the date palm would grow dates as fruits, the coconut palm tree would grow coconut, which to him looked like the head of a man, because the three spots would represent to him the eyes and the mouth, and the outer shell looks like the hair, which was used to make ropes in tying ships and for other purposes. And when you would crack the coconut shell open, the insides reminded him of the brain. He also tries to describe the betel leaf or pan ka patta in in whichever way that he can. The betel tree itself is not a tree that produces any fruit. It's only cultivated for its leaves, and that really fascinated Ibn Battuta, and he tried to convey his fascination in his words to the people that his text was meant for. Now, the coconut and the pan ka patta aren't the only things that Ibn Battuta describes in his works. He also gives descriptions of the cities that he visits, and the cities that he finds in the subcontinent, he describes them as vibrant places full of opportunity for whoever has the necessary drive and the skill to make it to these cities. The streets of these cities are lined with bazaars, and they are full of people, and it's very alive, except for the occasional war or invasion, after which the city is also quick to recuperate. He describes the cities as very prosperous. In fact, he describes Delhi as a very vast city which was densely populated, and he also describes Aurangabad as a city that is also vast, and it almost rivals Delhi in its scale.
The bazaars were just not a place of economic transactions, but also it was a space where cultural activities took place, social activities took place. There were mosques, there were temples, there were also areas assigned for music, for musicians to perform music, for the dancers to perform their dance, or singers. Ibn Battuta was not very concerned with describing the prosperity as such, but when historians have used his accounts, they get to know that these towns and cities were flourishing because they appropriated the surplus from the villages. Ibn Battuta states that in India, the agriculture was very productive. The soil was very fertile, and they could grow 2 crops in a year. The subcontinent was also well integrated with the inter-Asia trade and commerce, and even in the Western Asian countries and Southeast Asian countries, the Indian goods were in great demand, especially Indian manufactured goods, textiles, silks, muslins, cotton, then you also brocade, they were in great demand, and especially fine muslin was in great demand. Only the rich and the nobles could afford it, and only they wore these exquisite fabric. जो state थी, जो सल्तनत थी, they encouraged the merchants and the traders to indulge in trading activities. Obviously, जब आप trading activities में indulge करेंगे, economy boost करती है आपकी, और उतना ही फिर taxes भी आपको मिलते हैं. Whatever said and done, your economy increases, empire becomes richer. So these traders were encouraged. तो इनके encouragement के लिए जितने भी ट्रेड रूट्स थे उनमें इन्स या सराइज कंस्ट्रक्ट किए जाती थी सो दैट ट्रैवलिंग में कोई डिफ़िकल्टी ना आए. Ibn Battuta was also amazed by the postal system that was prevalent. Postal system was used to not only carry information but also remit credit across the subcontinent. They also provided goods and transported goods, especially in a short duration of time. The postal system was so efficient that it took 50 days to travel from Delhi to Sindh, though it took 50 days, but the postal system was so efficient that a spy's message could reach the Sultan within 5 days. So that was the efficiency at which Ibn Battuta was pretty amazed by, and he wrote about it in his accounts.
The next topic is Bernier and the degenerate East. Now, if, in comparison to Al-Biruni and Ibn Battuta, where they have a tendency of presenting something that is new, something that they've not seen, and presenting that to the readers, Bernier had a different motive behind his work. He was more preoccupied with comparing the situation that he saw in the Indian subcontinent to Europe in general and then to France in particular, and he wanted to present India as an example to the European readers of what not to do. And he wanted his aim through that was to push forth his ideas and what he thinks is the correct way to function and to do things. Inki jo kitab hai, Travels in the Mughal World, it provides a lot of critical insights and a lot of discussions about what he sees in India and what he disapproves of, and how the situation can be made better. He tries to place the Mughal world in a larger European framework. His representation of the Indian subcontinent works on the model of binary opposition. So if India is a particular way, it's the opposite of Europe, and by that extension Europe is superior to India, and he presents what he finds in India in such a way that it just highlights these differences, and that divide of the superior and the inferior is just drawn out more by Bernier. There was one perceived aspect of the Indian subcontinent, of the functioning of the Indian subcontinent, that really irked Bernier, and that was the crown ownership of land. He felt that the crown should not own land, that private property should exist, and he was an advocate of private property, and he wrongfully assumed that the land in the Mughal Empire was owned by the crown, and that the crown distributed the land among the nobles. This was not a unique view. Many European travelers who came during the 16th and 17th centuries also had a similar notion. But this is not the entire picture. He felt when the land is not privately owned, that restricted people or landowners from investing in the land, from bringing in new practices to bettering the agriculture, and that in turn prevented the emergence of the middle landlords, like a better class of landlords who would provide like the middle class in a society. This is something that did happen in Europe, and in Western Europe particularly, and Bernier had very strong views against it. Crown ownership of land to him would lead to a ruination in agriculture, in no innovation, in no improvement, and a steady decline of the peasantry or the condition of the peasantry. As an extension of this, Bernier seems to mention that the vast majority of India is so impoverished, and that they're ruled by a handful of aristocrats who control the land and who have all the power and all the riches with them. And he even went on to state that there is no middle state in India, effectively saying that there is no middle class. Now, this is not to say that poverty did not exist in India. It's not possible for poverty not to exist, but at the same time, it is criminal to say that there was no middle class in India at the same time, because who do you think made up your artisans and your lawyers and your medicine men? Those and the people that would provide education, those provided with a middle state in India, and to say that there was no middle state is very ignorant, and that is something that is also common in most European accounts of the time.
Curiously, none of the Mughal documents suggest that the land was solely owned by the state. We get to know when we read Abul Fazl's book Akbarnama. He was a court historian in the court of Akbar. He states that the taxes, the land tax was nothing but remuneration of sovereignty that was provided by the king in the form of protection rather than rent. All the European travelers who came to India, they thought that it was rent, but it wasn't a rent. They thought because rents were really, the revenue was really high. But another thing is that the land was not taxed, the crops were taxed. So whenever you read European accounts, it becomes very difficult for you to make any sense, because most of the things that they understood was very different from the reality.
So it's difficult to take them seriously at the same time.
अब बर्नियर ने ऐसे अकाउंट्स रखे थे, तो यूरोप में भी लोगों को इन्हीं अकाउंट्स ने इन्फ्लुएंस किया था. 18th century में there was a person named Montesquieu. He also termed the concept Oriental despotism, that the kings of Asia were barbarians. They were extracting the maximum out of the public. The public was subjugated to an extent that they were poverty stricken. All the land was owned by them. Only the ruler and the nobles enjoyed their lives. The rest barely managed to survive. This idea was further coined as Asiatic mode of production by Karl Marx in the 19th century, where they suggested that the kingdom or the ruler or the empires in Asia before colonialism, they were ruled by kings who extracted the maximum out of the populace. This led to the emergence of a society where there was autonomous and egalitarian village societies. The imperial court depended on these village communities and let them handle their village communities by themselves, and until unless the surplus is coming to the state, they did not interfere in the village society, and this led to a stagnant system. But this picture is far from true, because when you see the Mughal times, you see the villages is differentiated within the social and economic framework. You find rich zamindars, then you find big peasants who are hiring laborers to till their soil and for commodity production, crop production, and then you have really poor peasants also who could barely sustain themselves. So saying that the village was autonomous and they had no sort of relation with the state made them independent of their own, and until the surplus is coming to it, it's far from true. It was a very complex system. It was like a pyramid. The state could not survive without them, they could not survive without the state. So it was a pyramid of pyramidical structure. So Europeans failed to understand various economic and social structure in the subcontinent. So whatever they thought that could, match up to what they believed in, so they tried to correlate like that. Bernier had his own idea of this complex society. He believed that the manufacturers in the subcontinent, they should have improved themselves to manufacture commodities, textiles. They didn't have any incentive to improve themselves. So that was his, that what he saw, which was, as we know, far from true. Also that in the subcontinent, the commodities were exported outside in return for bullion, in return for gold, in return for silver. Trade was very important, and there were many traders and people who indulged in commercial activities. That was in large number. But if the manufacturing society was not very efficient, if the artisans were not very efficient, why would there be a demand for these products in the outer world? So he sometimes contradicts himself only. So at one point he's saying that artisans were not very good in their work, but in at another instance you will see he's saying that the world in the Western Asian countries or the Southeast Asian countries or any other country outside the subcontinent, they demanded Indian products in return, and in return they would be sending silver, gold, in short, bullion. So if their artisans were not good in their work, how is it possible that the demand for Indian products will be so high outside?
सोचने की बात है कि अगर इंडियन सब कॉन्टिनेंट में इतनी बर्बादी है तो जो अर्बन टाउन्स की जो पॉपुलेशन थी सब कॉन्टिनेंट में, हाउ कुड दैट बी ऑलमोस्ट 15% ऑन एवरेज, विच व्हेन कंपेयर्ड टू यूरोप वाज हायर. So the prosperity of the towns in the subcontinent on average was higher than that of Europe during the same time. Despite this, Bernier had the audacity to describe the prosperous Indian cities as camp towns. It is a term that he coined, and by this he means that the towns were built according to the court, and they depended on the patronage of the court for their existence. So as long as the court functioned, the city was prosperous, but if the court moved out, the city fell in itself and declined.
तो उससे तो मतलब अगर मुगल टाइम में अगर कैपिटल दिल्ली है तो लाहौर और आगरा तो ऐसे ही बैठे हैं फिर, मतलब
नहीं, वो तो बर्बाद हो रखे हैं.
और अगर इफ इट शिफ्ट्स टू आगरा और लाहौर तो दिल्ली बर्बाद है. These were the main core towns. He doesn't understand the concept.
According to Bernier, these camp towns did not have viable social or economic foundations to exist without the patronage of the state. अब जैसे ही उन्होंने लैंड ओनरशिप में अपने अजम्पशंस मारे थे, वैसे ही उन्होंने सिटीज़ में भी अपनी मतलब अजम्पशंस छोड़ी है. एंड ही हैज़ फेल्ड टू अंडरस्टैंड द नेचर ऑफ सिटीज़, वेयर इन फैक्ट the nature of cities was very vast. Within the subcontinent, you would find merchant towns, port towns, pilgrim centers, centers that were prosperous because they fell en route a pilgrimage site or some other important site. The very fact that these manufacturing towns, trading towns, pilgrim centers existed, they provide an index for the prosperity of the merchant community as well as the professional classes that drove the economy of these towns. Merchants की जब हम बात करते हैं तो they had their own community, they had a very strong community, and they were often based on kin ties, and they functioned in a caste cum organizational setup that helped drive their prosperity. Western India में जब हम देखते हैं तो this organizational group is called the Mahajans, and they are led by their chief who is called a Seth. In big merchant cities like that of Ahmedabad, the various clans of Mahajans are represented by a state chief called the Nagar Seth. But merchants weren't the only community that constituted the middle state or the middle class, or the only community that propelled the economy of the Indian subcontinent. We also have other groups. For instance, we have physicians who were either called Hakim or Ved. We have teachers who were either called mullahs or pandits. We have lawyers who were called vakils. We also have architects, we have painters, we have dancers, we have musicians. And while there was a portion of them that was that existed on the patronage of the court or of royal families or of nobles, but a variety of them gathered their patronage from other people, not from royalty. And then there was also a section of these people that gained their income through regular people in bazaars. So to say that there is stark poverty, there is no middle class, is a gross misconception in a way, because that is a very uninformed opinion, and maybe it is also of a malicious nature, because you want to present an image that is lesser than that of the European condition.
Yeah, because nobody, whenever he's going to show his accounts to his countrymen, nobody is going to go and check it, right? So it's like कि कुछ भी दिखा देते हैं अपनी मर्जी से. Though he had enjoyed his life in the Mughal court because he was stationed there, he was there in Shah Jahan's period. But it was more like, let me just show So let me just paint it in a way that nobody is going to check, or I can bring my own insecurities and my ignorance,
Yeah.
and show the way I want to show it to the people.
And although an attempt was made by Indians in 1750, specifically Sheikh Itisamuddin and Mirza Abu Talib, who traveled to Europe to confront this idea of the Indian subcontinent that was presented to the population, it is safe to say that they did not succeed, or that the Europeans were so convinced of the idea of the dilapidated Indian subcontinent,
The
despotic Indian subcontinent, or just the poverty, that is the idea that was also carried on by the colonizers when they made their way to the Indian subcontinent, and it was steeped so deep that it was also taken on by us. So for us to assume that before the colonizers we were actually a prosperous nation is something that that a part of the population is still not ready to accept.
Yeah. Women slaves, sati and laborers. तो जो ये ट्रैवलर्स आए थे दे वर मोस्टली मेन जिन्होंने अकाउंट छोड़े थे, एंड मोस्टली दे वर ऑल्सो प्रिटी मच इंटरेस्टेड इन टू लुक एट द स्टेट ऑफ women in the subcontinent, because they were interested to know how women were were treated in the subcontinent. Sometimes these travelers would ignore the social inequalities and would see that those social inequalities as something that was a part of the state, कि अच्छा ये normal है,
यहाँ पे
चलता है. जैसे for example slaves were bought and sold, that was exchanged also in the subcontinent. And when Ibn Battuta he reached Sindh, so he bought horses, camels and slaves for Muhammad bin Tughlaq. So he thought कि अच्छा slaves gift करना is something which is normal, and he did that. Also when he reached Multan, he gifted the governor with slaves, with raisins and horses and almonds. He also states that once Muhammad bin Tughlaq had gifted a preacher by the name of Nasiruddin with 100,000 tankas and 100 slaves. So sometimes they would not see the social inequality and see them as something that was, they thought that it was a part of the normal day-to-day life of the population of a particular place.
But in his defense, that was also the norm of the time, where it was not like, when we look at that time from today's lens, of course it's not correct, like you can't treat another person as a slave. But then during that time it was a very normal thing for it to exist.
But not only in the subcontinent, it was there in almost all the every empire was dealing with this.
So it was not something that was only available here. It was just like a global phenomenon where it was a thing that just
because things at that time looked normal to them, but that is the thing, never look at history from today's lens. Always see it from their own perspective, what was happening at that point. That makes it more interesting, and not as something, then you will not take sides of any ruler or any particular dynasty. You would see, okay, this was something normal, this is how the kings acted upon. Yes, there are certain things in the past that is wrong, and when we see it today and we see how things have changed in the modern times, it is wrong. Even during that time, many rulers banned those things. For example, Akbar had banned slavery. So somewhere they also understood this is something wrong, so they would act upon it as well. Ibn Battuta के अकाउंट से ये पता चलता है कि slaves में भी differentiation होती थी. For example, women slaves were also used as singers and dancers. They were there especially during weddings of nobles and kings की जैसे बहनों की शादियाँ होती थी, तो वहाँ पे they would be providing entertainment to the population, to the guests mostly. So Ibn Battuta had really enjoyed that also. Then these women slaves were also employed by the Sultan as spies. So it is easier for these slaves to spy upon the nobles or some officer or some a diplomat who's visited the court. Slaves were also used for domestic labor as helpers, and Ibn Battuta would also say that their services were indispensable, especially those who carried men and women on the dola, I think in kind of palki. He too had slave labor in his house, and mostly women slaves were the cost were low, the purchasing cost was low, and mostly people could afford one or two. European travelers की जब बात करते हैं, when it comes to their perception of women, they just start to compare women of the West and women of the East. Especially जब बर्नर की बात करते हैं तो सती को लेके he's written accounts and he said that though some women embraced death smilingly, some were forced into it. Obviously Sati was highlighted. Sati, that was something really wrong if we see it from today's perspective. But all these travelers, you know, somewhere did not see, they only highlighted the negatives. Women were just not this as they have portrayed. Women participated in agricultural practices and non-agricultural services for for constructing buildings.
Yeah.
Right? Trade, commercial activities, in that also they participated. At times they would take commercial disputes to court. Some women patronized art also. Some women were good in singing. They were patronized by the courts, by the nobles. They were just not confined in the walls of the houses. There were women also in the Mughal Empire who indulged in various activities. Gulbadan Bano Begum, who was Humayun's sister, she wrote Humayunama. Then you have Noor Jahan, who was actually ruling the empire. Who was Jahangir? She was Jahangir's wife. Then you have Sultan Razia, who was the first ruler of India, I would say, and she was appointed by her father. You have Shah Jahan's daughter, Jahanara, who designed Chandni Chowk, right? She had ships. She indulged in trading activities. She had constructed sarais, bags, and various other mosques. So they were just not confined to the walls as portrayed by these travelers.
You had many queens in the south who were also very popular.
Yeah.
And strong.
Yeah. Like you have Chand Bibi in the Deccan who fought against the Mughals. You know, she was looking after her husband's sultanate and her father's sultanate. So there were women who participated in every activity. Women even in the villages participated in various activities. So when you're reading their accounts, you have to be very careful. You have to have other sources also by your side so that you could check whether they are right or not. You know, you have primary sources, secondary sources.
And also I think when we look at the past, while it is important to look at it from the perspective of the time, so you can't compare it to today's age, but it's also important, I mean, you can't not look at the past through the present, because that is how you have a tendency of comparing it with your own time. But at the same time, you need to be mindful that what is perceived right now might not be the entire picture, and the picture that was at that time is much different than what is perceived by us today.
That's it for today. I hope that you've enjoyed today's episode. Please like, share and subscribe and keep watching Tariq.